Spooky? I feel like they're in the walls. Bing, 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 bing. No, I am the walls now. You know what? The people in the walls. Oh, you work for me now.
For the
Us.
young men
You
and
work for
women who
them,
make it their
and then I
first
work for
career
them.
choice, enlisting in the
They
military
work
is
for
a
me,
unique
and then I work
experience
for
in
you.
many regards, the least of which is how much their family, their
The men
parents,
in
siblings,
who?
etc.,
Racist.
play a role in this decision. Signing an 8-year contract is a weighty decision for
Will
someone
Smith?
just out of
I
high
can't.
school to
Hold
make.
on.
And let's be
Oh
honest,
wait,
most of us who have served could have
this
never
is somehow.
predicted what would then happen over those 8 years, good or bad. At the forefront of any family's concerns is, of course, the dangers involved with military service. And yes, many
Very
military career
spooky.
fields will expose service members to a
Should we scroll
variety
through
of
the comments?
risks. Far from the front lines in actual combat, it's no secret that more than half of all deaths in the military actually occur as the result of accidents and work-related illness or injury. In the end, though, many veterans
I
will
believe
say
it.
that the reward for serving their country was worth it. But when someone does get hurt, the least of what any family can ask for from their government
I
is
think it's
transparency.
fine. I'm
In the
like, thank
case
you,
of the
because we're
Whipkey
making
family,
memes.
however, this
Whole
is
world's, I
sadly
mean,
not the case. After
America's doing
all,
good
a
though.
bright young Army
We
pilot
got this.
with a promising future who kept regular communication with his loving family doesn't simply have all of his teeth pulled out, then one day decide to drive far off base, park his car in the middle of the desert, and go for a walk.
You pulled his teeth out?
But
I
that's
would.
exactly what his family was
Just going
told,
for a walk.
leaving all of us with many unanswered questions. What
No,
did he
but who is
know
still
that caused
identified
the
then? What
U.S.
was the
Army
teeth? You
to
know what I'm
immediately
saying?
declare a man with no history of wrongdoing a deserter and subsequently make no effort to look for him? Did his proximity in flying his aircraft near Area 51 have anything to do with his disappearance? Who were the strange men in black suits that witnesses saw intimidating him? Was he the unwitting victim of human experimentation by the U.S.
No,
government?
but that's wild.
And
I'm
why
like,
did the
why?
FBI
This is
conveniently
real.
claim they had burned all records of his case when his family began to demand answers? This is the story of the strange disappearance of Lieutenant Paul Whipkey.
I wish they would show a picture of the guy. Lieutenant Paul Whipkey.
You may remember that not too long ago we announced that Wartime Stories was joining Ballin Studios. In addition to turning this YouTube show into a podcast, we've also been secretly working on a new
This
podcast, and
guy.
I'm so excited to finally tell you about it. It's called Redacted, Declassified
Well, okay,
Mysteries with
where's the
me, Luke LaManna,
transcript?
and it's available right now
Show
wherever you get your
transcript.
podcasts. Don't worry, Wartime Stories isn't going anywhere. In fact, Redacted will sound very... In addition to turning strange disappearance of Lieutenant Paul Whipkey.
Whipkey. Lieutenant. Don't know how to spell it. Paul Whipkey. What the heck? On the August of 17th, 1958, a fish and game warden in the Death Valley of California, this is what he looks like. Death Valley, California, found a car abandoned in the desert 42 miles from the nearest town. The keys were still in the ignition, and there was no sign of foul play. The car was registered to Lieutenant Paul Whipkey, of Fort Ord, California, almost 500 miles away. The Army reported that Whipkey has been missing for 5 weeks and in fact was wanted as a deserter. But there was a problem. All accounts of Paul Whipkey were a perfect soldier, and no one knows him or believes he could have been a deserter. Carl Whipkey is Paul's brother. I don't think Paul deserted. It was completely out of character for Paul to do such a thing. He was a loyal American soldier, devoted to his work. I think the Army knew exactly what happened to him, and I think it was a part of a big smokescreen cover-up. Paul Whipkey was a ROTC, honored graduate. After basic training, he won a spot in the Army's aviation school. In 1958, at Camp Desert Rock in Nevada, Paul flew an observation plane during the test of an atomic bomb. He was exposed to radioactive fallout. Teeth fallout? I don't know, man. And as soon as after when the unusual blotches appeared on his skin several months later, stationed at Fort Ord, California, Paul had to have all his teeth removed. Oh, so this was during training, right? 57? When did he go missing? Huh. On July 10th, 1958. Later that afternoon, Paul left Fort Ord. He told his friends that he was headed with no teeth already. This is pre-after teeth. Yeah, 57 was several months later. So in 58. So teeth, this is okay. He was headed out of town in Monterey, less than a mile away, but Paul never returned. The next morning, Paul was reported AWOL. 30 days later, he was declared a deserter. The following week, his car was discovered in Death Valley. Army says that on the day Paul left, he apparently ended up at White's Motel in Mojave, California, some 350 miles from the base. Paul has signed the motel's guest registration. Army's investigators say that they found a gasoline receipt in Paul's car. It showed that he bought a gas in Moab before his car ended up in Death Valley. Whoa, 145 miles away. I mean, you could get there on like fucking no gas. On the very morning Paul turned up missing, two soldiers stripped his room at Fort Ord and removed including Paul's personal belongings, according to his brother Carl. This was odd and perhaps a legal procedure. Regulations state that the next of kin or legal representative must be notified before packing belongings, and they didn't notify us at the time. I was very suspicious of this action as soon as I discovered it has taken place. Well, for weeks, Paul was reported AWOL. A witness driving through Death Valley saw his car and said he was driven. What? And said it was driven by a man in military uniform. However, Paul left Fort. When he left, oh, he wasn't wearing anything? Or not like that. He was wearing civilian clothes. When the car was found, a pile of cigarette butts was on the ground next to it. Paul didn't smoke. Also troubling to Paul's family were the fact that the army waited 9 months before looking for his body. For looking for his body? 9 months? I thought he was AWOL and then reported missing and then found. And it was by accident by Carl Whipkey. Heard anything about the car at all? The only way I learned about the car was due to an unofficial call I placed in to an unlisted man in Fort Ord. Within a half an hour, he called back very excited and said this is a classified information and request that I not to tell anyone where I had heard it. What the fuck? The investigation into Paul's disappearance also troubled his commanding officers, Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Lewis. I found it almost unbelievable that he would be classified as a deserter. I was curious what the basis for it was, and I promptly told Charlie, forget this. The case has been closed, and I would recommend you don't carry on any further. In essence, I was told to shut up and drop it and blow away. Charles Lewis and Paul Whipkey, both stationed in Nevada in 1957. Lewis recalls the day he saw two men in plainclothes talking to Paul. I noticed they had gone directly to the airfield instead of reporting to operations, which is required for personnel of security, so I asked them for identification. They showed me the military identification cards, and the picture did verify who they were. Over the next few weeks, Lewis and Paul were what? Talking to the same two men. When Lieutenant Whipkey came to what would come in after they departed, you would feel rigid in his personality traits and his mannerism. In hindsight, Lewis now believes that Paul may have met with two men for a simple reason. During that era, there were a tremendous amount of nationwide recruiting conducted by the CIA, and Lieutenant Whipkey's qualifications, he would have been a special candidate for this assignment. Oh, jeez, dude. Whoa. Oh, this is almost over. I was like, I just looked at the scroll. Paul's brother Carl thinks that it may be some truth to this as well. Faked his own death, now works for the fucking military. Fake body. Praise be. Maybe he's alive. I hope he's alive and doing well. Probably is in secret. Or they killed him. I don't know. Spook. Paul's brother Carl thinks there may be some truth to this as well. January of the year he disappeared, he told me during the telephone conversation that he was going on an assignment and he was going to make a name for himself. Before he could tell me what it was, he was interrupted by officers moving in the proximity of his desk, and he could no longer talk to me about the subject. I theorized that Paul was recruited by the Army CIA joint program that was going on at the time. When Paul left for Fort Ord, he drove into town of Moave, California, and checked into White's Motel. There's possibility that he was there to meet Army intelligence agents or the CIA and transported to Southeast Asia, possibly from Edwards Air Force Base, which is nearby. Cora now believes his brother was assigned to a secret mission and left his car with the Army. Thinks they kept it for 4 weeks before driving to the desert, but not knowing the answer leaves him wondering. Whoa, so they assignment him. Done assignment. Boom, gone. I think the Army took his car out to the desert to get rid of it, out of sight, out of mind. And if they were to say, yes, he died on secret assignment, we could live with that. We're all loyal American citizens in our family, and we would buy that. Until the Army tells us what happened, there will be no peace in our family. Fuck, bro. In 1992, the Army reviewed Paul Whipkey's case and found no basis in support of his status as desert. 2 months later, his final status was officially charged from deserter to died in the line of duty. Oh. I mean, that's at least a little respectful. That sucks. What the fuck? This has to do with the CIA or aliens. What the fuck, dude? This is what he looked like. Open image in new tab.
You may remember that not too long ago we announced that Wartime Stories was joining Ballin Studios.
This is,
in addition,
whoa, we just read that whole thing.
In a new episode. Born on April 25th, 1932 in Murraysville, Pennsylvania, it didn't take Paul Whipkey long to realize that he wanted a career in the U.S. Army. Enrolling in the Pennsylvania State University Reserve Officer Training Corps, or ROTC, the aspiring soldier would graduate in 1954 with an Army commission and a degree in civil engineering. From there, Whipkey sought to earn his flight wings, becoming an Army aviator by 1956, tasked with flying small, propeller-driven aircraft for various observational tasks. While the United States and its NATO allies were locked in a tense standoff with the Soviet Union in Europe, the newly christened First Lieutenant Whipkey's first duty station assignment would find him at a lonesome outpost in the middle of the Nevada desert, a place called Camp Desert Rock. By 1957, the world was on uncertain footing, with many convinced that a nuclear exchange between the West and East was only a matter of time. As a result, the United States government ramped up the development and testing of their ever-evolving nuclear arsenal. Though atomic weapons were still in their infancy, the warheads being tested for the feared Third World War already far surpassed the destructive capabilities of those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki a little over 10 years earlier. Camp Desert Rock was just one place that served as a testing range for these weapons. It also served as a training area where soldiers could observe the effects of nuclear explosions on the environment and prepare for operations in a hypothetical radioactive war zone. As part of his first official assignment, Whipkey would take part in what was called Operation Plum Bomb. The operation was a mixture of atmospheric and underground nuclear detonations carried out between May 28th and October 7th, 1957.
Maybe it's...
Of the 29 blasts that
confusing.
occurred, Whipkey took part in at least 5. While troops would observe these tests from the ground, Army aviators like Whipkey would do so from the air, his reports giving researchers an invaluable bird's-eye view of the explosion and its effects on both the ground and at higher altitudes.
Like, is that him in the car?
However, there was an even darker purpose to some of these tests, one that military officials withheld to many unknowing participants.
This is his car.
On paper, the soldiers observing the blasts were always kept at quote-unquote a safe distance, assuring they were spared any of the weapon's harmful effects. However, this was not always the case. In many instances, such as the infamous Jason test, the partaking soldiers were deliberately brought within range of the nuclear fallout so that its effects could be observed on the human body. For the most part, the soldiers who volunteered or were otherwise roped into the tests were largely kept in the dark regarding the dangers of radioactive exposure. Flying around in his small aircraft within proximity of the nuclear blasts, Whipkey, like so many troops on the ground, was bombarded with dangerous amounts of radiation. In the aftermath of participating in a number of these observational flights, the young officer's health began to take a turn for the worse. After only a handful of observational flights, the effects of radiation sickness were beginning to take a toll on Lieutenant Whipkey. The first signs came in the way of small black moles spread across his body, which were then followed by extensive rashes resembling burns and painful blisters developing on his hands. Eventually, the radiation began to wreak havoc on Whipkey's bodily functions, resulting in intense stomach pains that almost completely stripped the man of his desire to eat.
5 years ago.
While being treated in the base's infirmary, Whipkey's condition would further deteriorate as, one by one, his teeth began to fall out of his mouth.
What is this
With
one?
no way to effectively counter the effects of the radiation, Army medical staff removed the remainder of Whipkey's teeth, replacing them with a set of fitted dentures. In just a few months, Paul Whipkey had gone from being in peak physical condition to complete shambles, his mental health also taking a steep nosedive as he was transferred to Fort Ord, California in October 1957.
Whipkey requesting information. Whoa.
To his friends, family, and superiors, Whipkey was known as a dedicated and professional soldier. Though his military career was just starting, he had developed a reputation as a strong leader, greatly respected by his subordinates and valued by his commanding officer. However, during the latter part of Whipkey's tenure at Camp Desert Rock, those around him started to notice an alarming change in his behavior. The normally calm and cool officer had seemed to become more erratic and withdrawn, distancing himself from both loved ones and peers. While his radiation sickness almost certainly had an effect on his overall mentality, it appeared as if Whipkey was constantly on edge, always glancing over his shoulder as if he was being followed or watched. It was no secret amongst the officers at Fort Ord that Whipkey had fallen terribly ill.
So he thinks his brother
during the
is
course
on a
of his
secret
duties.
mission, and this is why.
Perhaps this is why they didn't look too deeply into the cause of the young officer's paranoia, thinking it was just a side effect of his radiation-damaged
Someone
mind.
looked at this and was like, this is so
Maybe
sad.
when Whipkey told them he was going into town to grab a drink on July 10th, 1958,
He's like, my brother's
they
a
thought it
secret
was a
agent.
welcome turn. Some time away from the stress of work could probably do the poor guy a bit of good. They had no idea
He's
that
requesting
that would be the
information
last
from the
time
CIA
Paul Whipkey
and being like,
was
you
ever
guys
seen
hire
again.
him. You guys had to check your files.
2 days
Check
later,
all the
on July
files for his
12th,
name.
Paul Whipkey's brother, Carl,
Furthermore, it is
telephoned Fort
requested that you
Ord in
check your
hopes of
agency's
catching up with his younger
applications for
sibling.
employment records.
Despite Paul's attempts to
Contract
distance
signed,
himself from his
'cause maybe it was
family,
off contract.
Carl was
It's like,
adamant
fuck,
about
bro.
maintaining contact,
His brother's
especially with
distraught.
Paul's string of health issues.
This sucks.
However, between the officer's
Maybe it was
treatments and
aliens.
military duties, catching his brother at an opportune time was
Something
easier said
happened.
than done. It had been many months since their last
'cause it's
conversation,
like, what's the
which
mystery?
was an odd one, to say the least. In a hushed voice, Paul was excitedly rambling on to Carl about an important assignment he was slated to take part in, one that he said would, quote, make a name for himself.
Oh, I
Carl
commented
was
on this,
unable
yeah?
to extract
I thought
further
this was super
details
funny.
from his brother, who said he
Someone
couldn't divulge
commented,
the information
I got
due to some
exclusive
officers
beats for
standing
$9.99. They're
nearby.
dead ass, dude.
Since
They are
then,
dead ass
despite
about
Carl's
that.
many attempts to
I was like,
reach
can I
out,
rap on them for free?
Paul had seemingly dropped off the family
You go
radar.
to his channel, yeah? Yeah.
His concern only worsened
Trap
when,
beats.
after phoning into Fort Ord, the operator
Wow.
told Carl
Oh,
that
A$AP
Paul
Rocky
had been
too.
listed as going AWOL,
Like shot.
or absent
someone?
without official leave, the day prior.
It's caught.
The news stunned
Yeah, but
Carl.
I mean, he didn't have
Even
nothing
with his
even
brother's
bad, dude. It
erratic
wasn't
behavior
even-
of late, he was still a committed
wasn't even
soldier
like that. They
who
couldn't even
wasn't one
find
to
proof
simply
of
walk off the
him,
job without
shells.
reason.
And then the shells that they
As
did
he
find?
pressed for details regarding Paul's whereabouts and well-being, Carl took note of how cagey and elusive the
We
operator
watched something with
was
A$AP.
when responding to his questions. However, what information they were willing to give Carl struck him as particularly unnerving. At that point, Paul Whipkey was only classified as being AWOL, meaning that while he left his
something
post without
happened.
advance warning or permission, there was no reason for the army to assume he'd outright deserted. And yet, despite this, Carl was told that
Like,
men
maybe
had
it was
already
the
started
radiation,
packing up
kinda.
all of his brother's personal belongings to be shipped to his next of kin. To Carl, that made no sense, and as far as military regulations go, was outright illegal. If anything were to happen to Paul, his chain of command should have notified the family before clearing out all of his items. But no such calls were made to the Whipkey family. Despite only being missing for a little over 24 hours, to Carl, it felt as if the army knew that wherever Paul was, he wasn't coming back. When his brother's items finally arrived at his home, Carl found an overlooked document detailing Paul's participation in Operation Plum Bomb and the 5 observational flights he took during hazardous nuclear testing. And the deeper he dug into his brother's military records, the more Carl became convinced that the Army, or some other organization, was behind his brother's disappearance. And he wasn't the only one who started to sense that something was off about the whole ordeal.
Oh, they just found the car, dude. We are learning so much. He was recruited.
In early August of 1958,
I'm like,
Lieutenant
welcome.
Whipkey's official status
Oh,
was
dude.
changed from AWOL to that of being a deserter. Upon hearing this news, the soldier's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Lewis, was left dumbfounded.
I don't know.
During his time at both Camp Desert Rock and Fort Ord, Lieutenant Whipkey had given the man little to complain about in way of poor conduct. Surely, given the young officer's declining health, him being missing should be a matter of great concern. And yet, now only a month after he had last been seen, Lewis couldn't see much urgency in the faces
Holy
of the
fuck,
command
his
staff with
brother's
regard to the missing
right.
soldier. Where were the search parties, investigators, or house calls to friends and family? And the more Lewis dug for answers, the harder it
No,
seemed
because
the
it's
military
like, why
worked
would they,
to block
the
his
only reason why would they
efforts.
say AWOL?
Eventually,
is for
Lewis
the
was
other
confronted
people
on the matter
that's
and
working
urged to
alongside with
drop
him.
it
So
altogether.
they're like, yeah, secretly he
The entire
propagated you
situation
guys or
reeked
something, you know
of
what I'm
something
saying?
strange. What that was, Lewis couldn't say. However, as he reflected on his time serving alongside
No,
Whipkey
because
at Camp Desert Rock, he remembered
It does
things
make
that,
no
in
sense.
the moment,
And then the reason why
seemed
they change
rather
it is because
unusual.
his brother's going skits about it.
Now, with no
But then
sign of his
they're
fellow
like, "Oh, God, we
officer
didn't
and the
expect
army
the
seeming
chiefs
to
who-
block all attempts to find
if
him,
they hire
those
you,
events took on a
who
far
gives a
more
fuck what
ominous
happens?
light.
Boom, boom, bing, bing, bong,
On
you're
several
dead.
occasions, both
You don't
before and
exist.
after
I never
missions,
existed.
Lewis
Said the
observed
paperwork's
men
gone.
dressed in
I'm
civilian
gone. I
clothes
work for
walking
God now.
around the base.
It's like, that's...
Whoever they were they definitely weren't military. Never once had he seen them be processed by the classified
But then
site's
it's like,
tight
did
security.
they expect his
Furthermore,
brother
they
to be
seemed
like,
to regularly
oh
converse
wow,
with Lieutenant Whipkey.
oh wow, I believe
While
because
Lewis
of this,
never learned about the nature of their
I have a
hushed
hard time believing in
conversations,
aliens.
he and many others noticed how
crazy,
unsettled
spooky.
Whipkey was
This for some reason
by the
I'm like,
presence of these strange men.
This is the proof.
It certainly wasn't lost on Lewis that their arrival
And
coincided
it's
with
because
Whipkey's
they
deteriorating
release,
health.
yeah, because no one knows.
Could that
Someone
be
probably
what drew
did
the
look at this
shady
and was like,
individuals towards the unsuspecting lieutenant?
because it is
Or
his
perhaps,
brother's like
as he had
secret
hinted
agent.
on the
My
phone,
brother has to be.
was this
He's
just a
not
part
crazy.
of a far larger
His
web
brother
that
was.
Whipkey had found
ripped his
himself
teeth out.
tangled in?
No one knows. I mean, it's fingerprint removal. But then it's like, no, again, no one is supposed to care. I mean, not like, oh, sad, whatever.
About a week after he was
But it's
declared
like,
a
that's the
deserter,
recruitment. You're
Paul's
plucked.
vehicle
You're plucked
was
from
finally
everything.
discovered,
Listen, you work for the
though
aliens.
not by military authorities. Over 500 miles away from Fort Ord, 40 miles from the nearest town, and 15 miles from the
But then
main
it's
road,
like his brother. Wow,
it was a fish
dude,
and
I
game
believe
warden
it, actually.
who stumbled
Wow.
upon the
I might
1956
believe in
Chevy
aliens now.
left
and the
abandoned
whole
in the
fucking
heart
shabab.
of Death Valley, California.
Yeah, very
Though
cool.
it was in rough
Not
shape,
cool.
having been
I
left
mean,
out in the desert sun for quite some time, the car bore no
who's
signs
Carl?
of
I hope
damage
he's
or
still
foul
alive.
play.
I want to be like, you're
Eerily
right.
enough, the
He's like,
keys
right about
were
what?
still
I'm
in
like,
the
I don't
ignition,
know.
a pair of dog tags etched with Whipkey's name being found alongside a small briefcase of personal belongings.
Like dog tags?
When word of this discovery reached the U.S. Army, they arrived at a fairly neat and tidy conclusion for what happened to the missing officer. According to the official report, First Lieutenant Whipkey suffered a severe mental breakdown due to stress associated with an upcoming assignment. Not thinking straight, he abandoned his post and drove out to Death Valley, where he would wander off into the desert to inevitably die of exposure.
Yeah, but where, dude?
To
Where
Carl,
is it?
this explanation was littered with holes and oversights. Also, if he were to take this explanation at face value, then where was the effort to recover Whipkey's body? Deserter or not, the military was known to go to any lengths in order to recover the dead. In fact, a formal search for Whipkey's remains wouldn't begin until a staggering 9 months after his car was discovered. At that point, finding any trace of Whipkey, let alone an intact corpse, would be next to impossible. To many associated with the case, it seemed as if the military considered this was an open and shut investigation. The same could not be said for Carl Whipkey, who, from the moment he was told of his brother's disappearance, embarked on a journey to uncover the truth behind his fate.
Now it's like, did the army do something? Because 9 months is a wild time to wait. But then maybe someone knew chain of command.
Over the course of the next 25 years, Carl would gather an impressive array of evidence that lends credence to the idea of Paul, his brother, being caught up in some sort of conspiracy. As per Carl's findings, it was revealed that on July 10th, 1957, the last day Paul was seen, he had departed Fort Ord and made a beeline to White's Motel, located 300 miles away in Mojave. According to the guest book, he would sign in that night and out the next day, where, according to a receipt found in his car, he would then go to purchase 14 gallons of gasoline. From where Paul was last reported in Mojave, that would be more than enough fuel to get him the rest of the way to Death Valley.
14?
However, Carl isn't certain that it was Paul who drove the car any further beyond White's Motel.
He
believed that Mojave was some kind of rendezvous point for Paul and whoever he was in contact with. The unknown men in question commandeering the vehicle in order to dispose of it. To back this, Carl points to the testimony of the wildlife wardens who first came upon Whipkey's abandoned car. According to them, the ground around it was littered with burnt cigarette butts. However, Paul had never touched a cigarette in his life. The testimony of a local rancher also seems to lend this theory some validity. According to Carl, the man had supposedly seen a vehicle matching the one owned by Paul around the time he vanished.
Yeah, but he left everything behind.
However, he distinctly remembered that the man behind the wheel of the car was dressed in formal military attire. When Lieutenant Whipkey was last seen leaving Fort Ord on July 10th, base personnel unanimously agreed that he was in civilian clothes. To boot, the suitcase discovered in the back of the officer's car held nothing by way of a military uniform.
Everything was planted?
While speaking with Lieutenant Colonel Charles Lewis, it came to light that another Army aviator who had served alongside Paul had met a similarly grim fate. His name was First Lieutenant Charles Guess, a good friend of Whipkey's who served alongside him at Camp Desert Rock. On July 22, 1958, just 12 days after Whipkey went missing, Guess took off from Bishop, California in a reconnaissance plane and then vanished. In September 1959, wreckage of the plane and Guess's remains were discovered on White Mountain in Inyo National Forest. Oddly, the wreckage supposedly had a different serial number than the plane Guess originally took off in. Seeking more information, Carl formally reached out to the FBI in 1978, asking them to release any material relating to the case under the Freedom of Information Act. It is undeniably suspicious that, according to Carl, the FBI burned all documents relating to the case mere months before he called in December of the previous year. Taking into account the many oddities surrounding his brother's untimely disappearance, combined with the covert nature of his involvement in nuclear tests, Carl arrived at two possible conclusions. Theory 1 is that Paul was approached by members of an intelligence agency, like the CIA, and possibly recruited for a top-secret assignment, one from which they knew he would never return.
Publications?
In the grand scheme of things, this is a reasonable assumption. After all, the CIA likely knew that due to his advanced radiation sickness, Whipkey was a dead man walking. Until his inevitable death, however, he was still a gifted aviator, one that could be of use to them on a particularly dangerous clandestine assignment. This possibility certainly brings to mind the strange phone call Paul had with his brother mere months before he disappeared, in which he spoke of a significant operation he had been assigned to.
Badass.
Theory 2 is far darker in nature.
They have this somewhere.
Experimentation.
That you could look at resources.
What if, instead of trying to recruit Whipkey, the strange men seen around Camp Desert Rock were there to intimidate him? At that point in history, the military's nuclear testing program was one of the most tight-lipped and secretive of any government project. Of course, people knew that nuclear weapons were being tested on a weekly basis. It was the Cold War after all, and someone had to keep the Soviets in check. But the US military deliberately exposing its own fighting men to lethal doses of radiation for the sake of research? If word got out, an outraged public would almost certainly turn on the government, thus putting a halt on a vital part of their nuclear studies. Is it possible that those shadowy agents were there to ensure Whipkey's silence, perhaps assessing whether or not he would be a potential whistleblower? This leads us to the chilling but unavoidable thought that these operatives not only orchestrated Lieutenant Whipkey's disappearance,
and they're like, no,
but also his murder.
I'm like, I just want to say hi, dude.
When considering the fate that befell his close friend Charles Guess and the oddities surrounding his case, is it too far-fetched to think that Paul Whipkey met a similar unjust end?
Reading rooms, dude.
In In 1982, Carl Whipkey would present his findings to the Army Board of Corrections in hope of reviewing his brother's case, possibly even opening the door for further investigation.
Korean War Collection?
While no new federal efforts would be made to look into Paul Whipkey's ordeal,
Oh,
a 3-day
Atlantis?
hearing was held that concluded there was no evidence to support Paul's status as a deserter. As a result, his status was officially changed to died in the line of duty.
Let's hit number 9.
But the Army did not provide any additional explanation about what actually happened to him. While an unjustified black mark on the honorable soldier's record had been lifted, Carl and the rest of the Whipkey family were still left without closure.
Number
to this
9,
day,
dude? Come on,
no trace of Paul Whipkey has ever been found. For many sleuths and conspiracy theorists, Whipkey's case bears a number of eerie resemblances to encounters involving those who are known as the Men in Black. Beginning in the late 1940s, a number of people reported being visited by strange men dressed in black suits, typically in the aftermath of witnessing what they interpreted to be an unidentified flying object.
Why would you skip so far?
Through thinly veiled threats, these men would coerce the witnesses into silence, implying that there would be consequences if they kept talking about things seen or heard. While there is no information available to lead us to believe Lieutenant Whipkey's case is involved with any sort of UFO cover-up, there is one final, interesting note about his military service that makes you think about some of the things he may have witnessed during Operation Plum Bomb. A mere stone's throw away across the Nevada wilderness from Camp Desert Rock is another secretive military site, one that supposedly harbors technology
you don't care about any of this other stuff?
of this Earth.
Alright, dude.
A place known,
I mean, look at the first
as
document.
you guessed it,
we'll start from ground zero.
Area 51.
Come on, brother.
Hey guys, Luke here. Normally, we would do some kind of after action, maybe share a personal story here in the credits, but because
Whoa. Pretty long video? I mean, it's not loading. We are oh, what the heck? None of this is even... We're oh my god. Oh, number 1.